80 plus certification for power supplies doesn't necessarily mean that the power supply is good or safe, nor does it really tell you anything about the power supply besides one thing, which is its efficiency and to some extent power factor. So in this video, we are going to talk about specifically what 80 plus is and what it isn't. And in addition to doing that, we'll be going over some of the key points for power supplies as you're researching them, trying to figure out what to buy that you might want to consider outside of if it has an 80 plus gold sticker on it. Clearly, this is not a measure of quality because this one was exploding and it's 80 plus gold, but it did hit the efficiency mark. And then the Ares Game AGS 850 wasn't exploding in our testing, but it didn't hit the efficiency mark despite claiming gold. So we're going to go over how that happens today. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. There's an enormous amount of faith put into 80 plus, and it kind of makes sense why you would see comments where people are sort of saying, well, just buy 80 plus gold. It's because generally speaking, it probably is indicative of better quality components, but not always. It's kind of the same way that with a car or something, you might be able to measure by horsepower to some extent, or miles per gallon, or any other metric, but it's just one small aspect of it. There's an enormous amount of faith that gets put into the 80 plus sticker on a power supply. We've already shown that obviously the sticker can be fraudulent, or maybe at one point it was valid, but it has become invalid as they've changed components since they sampled the power supply for testing. We've also shown that it doesn't test for protections or safeties, and it also doesn't test for things like voltage ripple. So now you're just getting into more of just straight up quality of the power supply in general, how stable it might be for certain high-end components or overclocking or whatever. So 80 plus, it gets a lot of credit that it probably shouldn't get, and we think the reason it gets that credit is because a power supply is probably one of the most misunderstood components, maybe next to memory. That's up there too. And because of that, it's difficult with especially a dearth of reviews to know what marks a good power supply. And the easiest marker on a power supply is the sticker that almost all of them bear, which is 80 plus something. And so that becomes a tiering system for a lot of people, a lot of system builders, where they'll search based on a certain expectation of 80 plus gold is probably safe, but it's not always. So an 80 plus does not test protection. It doesn't test short circuit protection, under voltage protection, over power protection, over current protection, any over temperature protection. None of that gets evaluated in the 80 plus process. The only thing that gets evaluated in 80 plus is the efficiency. The efficiency check is really just AC wall power to DC component power, and that's sort of about it other than power factor. 80 plus was formerly Ecova and plug load solutions as well, but now it's run by Clear Result, which defines 80 plus as follows. It's a performance specification that requires power supplies in computers and servers to be 80% or greater energy efficient at 20, 50, and 100% of rated load with a true power factor of 0.9 or greater. 80 plus certifications include these levels. There's 80 plus blank. We sometimes call this 80 plus white because of the sticker color, followed by 80 plus bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and titanium. Silver is incredibly rare at this point. Normally they're very close to either bronze or gold, so they just go that route. Titanium is newer than the others, and it's the only level that requires 10% load testing, while the other levels only require testing at 20, 50, and 100% rated load. A power supply is not a fixed percentage efficiency at all load levels. This chart from a previous test of ours helps illustrate that. Efficiency at, say, 2% or 10% would commonly be lower than at 50%, for example. And that's why 80 plus tests against multiple load levels. As for power factor, that's evaluated so that the power supplies aren't pulling a disproportionate amount of apparent power for the amount of true or real power that's being used. If you'd like a quick primer on this, we give you the beer glass analogy. We encourage you to attempt to replicate this at home via store.gamersnexus.net with one of our GN Cobalt Blue beer glasses with a PC component style bar runner spill guard underneath. The glass represents the apparent power in its entirety, or what you might see on a simple kilowatt meter when reading just watts. while the foam head is the reactive power, or the energy stored, like in a coil, before flowing back to the grid. The beer that's shown in the glass is the real power. That's the power we're going to need if we review another power supply that lies about its efficiency. And this is a pretty common demonstration. Arrow, for example, has it on its website where it sells small parts for power factor. But it's those two things, it's efficiency and power factor, that get looked at in 80 plus testing. Knowing what 80 plus is, which is an efficiency and power factor certification, and then comparing it to a good power supply review makes it pretty clear what it's not. We already said that it has nothing to do with OTP, OPP, OCP, OVP, UVP, or SCP. Additionally, 80 plus testing does not evaluate voltage regulation at varied loads. It doesn't look at voltage ripple. It doesn't look at transient load testing. And each of these affects the power output to performance components like CPUs and GPUs. It also just shows you the quality of the power supply. Sometimes these are the things that people mean when they talk about clean power or good power to a CPU or GPU. Commonly, this will be used for wall power, where someone might talk about make sure you have a good power source from the wall for your extreme overclock, where you're using something like maybe 2 power supplies to power 2 or 4 GPUs or something. That could be the clean power source, the wall. It could also be the power supply, where voltage ripple, if it's a power supply that maybe is otherwise good but has poor voltage ripple or poor transient load response reliability, then you're going to have a bad time with those higher overclocks. Bad ripple can cause system instability. So even if the power supply is 80 plus rated, it might be incapable of running certain performance parts with a reasonable level of stability. These clear result 80 plus certifications also don't evaluate things like hold up time, or how a power supply might perform in a brownout, for example, where you need it to survive those brief flickers in power that's being supplied to it from elsewhere in order to keep the system running instead of just shutting down when there's a brownout or a flicker or whatever. The statement then that an 80 plus certified power supply is a good power supply is incorrect, because it's very possible for an 80 plus certified power supply, this is one of them, the AGS 850 is one of them, we're just using those as recent examples, but it's possible for them to be bad for other reasons. It could be catastrophic, or it could just be kind of nitpicky if you're an overclocker, but it really doesn't look at the whole picture. 80 plus is still okay as a gauge of efficiency, but especially recently it's become maybe too much of an easy thing to lean on for supporting the purchase of a power supply where otherwise there's little information available or maybe little effort invested by the user to understand the product. 80 plus certification processes can also have their test results rigged. A memo published by Cooler Master mentions that a manufacturer can, quote, build a special sample for testing but use inferior materials for mass production. This would be basically the definition of rigging a result or cheating at the test. There's also a problem with receiving the certificate. Although it's required for the power supply to continue meeting the spec to retain the certification, the AGS 850 Gold does have an actual certificate and was legitimately certified, despite no longer reaching gold status in retail samples. Manufacturers only need to certify one time. So as they change parts and downclass the PSU, technically they're supposed to recertify, but it's possible that it falls below the certification despite originally reaching the status and it's never tested again. 80 Plus also doesn't test much for standby power consumption. So if you're in the EU market, this measurement is needed for compliance with ERP Lot 6 and ERP Lot 3 directives. As a separate issue, keep an eye out for fake 80 Plus badges. There's not a lot that Clear Result can do about these, especially the ones that fall under the confusingly similar category rather than just straight up counterfeit, but they're commonly found among bottom of the barrel power supplies. There's no such thing, for example, as 90 Plus from Clear Result or any other standards organization that actually makes sense. So no, 90 Plus does not mean it's 90% efficient or better. What it does mean is it's trying to trick you, and it's actually a pretty brilliant way to do it, because for most people who don't build computers all the time, if they see everything says 80 Plus, this one says 90 Plus, and they have a vague idea that this has to do with efficiency, it starts to seem pretty compelling, but those are illegitimate. There are other downsides too. The system is pretty merciful. There's actually not a hard limit to how many times a manufacturer can be caught cheating the results or lying about its product or shipping fraudulent samples and then changing them later. So this means that if a company achieves a rating illegitimately, there's not like a hard cutoff where Clear Result says, nope, we're not going to give you another certificate. They just try again with another power supply. And to be clear, the testing itself also isn't done by Clear Result. It's done by third-party validation labs. This is fine. This is somewhat standard for, well, any standard or certification, because there's too much volume for one company to do it all, and they just want to print the sticker and sell it. So it's all farmed out to third-party testing partners. Hopefully these points help to demonstrate that there are several aspects of power supplies that the 80+ certification never touches, and that, like most things, it's not a foolproof process. To use a really simple car analogy, 80+ is similar to saying that a car's gas mileage is a mark of its quality, that a better gas mileage means a better car. To some extent, this can be true. It could be that you only care about the gas mileage, in which case it's maybe your most important metric, but it's still not all-encompassing. It doesn't tell you everything about the vehicle. There are many other aspects to look at, and it's completely possible to make a car with high gas mileage, but very poor quality elsewhere, maybe poor safety as a perfect analog to the power supplies, where it can be very efficient, but still unsafe in other ways if there's, say, a grounding issue. A possible explanation for how the whole 80+ equals quality thing got started might be from some of Ecova's early marketing. It all revolved around improved power quality, they repeatedly said, and often spoke of, quote, benefits of improved power quality. So now that we've outlined some of the downsides of 80+, we'll talk about some of the upsides. It actually is useful for what it's meant to be used for, which is an efficiency rating. It has extremely well-defined requirements for testing. It has good documentation laying out the protocol for doing testing, and it's really straightforward. As an end user, you can pull up 80+ reports on power supplies. If you go to their website, you can search the database and make sure it's actually there. So that's kind of cool too. The protocol focuses on controlling 4 variables: input voltage, input frequency, output bus loading, and duty cycle of the cooling fan. It notes that these are the minimum variables that need to be controlled, and others like harmonic distortion can be added to testing. 80+ testing suggests 115 volts at 60 Hertz and 230 volts at 60 Hertz, and it also suggests staying within plus or minus 1% of these values. The protocol also specifies a time interval of 15 minutes at each load to ensure a steady state of operation. The steady state is precisely defined as a total input power reading over 2 consecutive 5-minute intervals that doesn't exceed plus or minus 1%. For its faults, 80+ protocol does actually keep things tight, and it requires a high level of precision. There are 5 different cooling solutions discussed as well, with each being a variable based on the power supply's market, so they've even controlled down for individual markets. Despite the earlier complaints about 80+, then, it's well defined. Here's a few of the other variables that they recommend controlling for lab testing for doing 80+ certification. We'll put all of them on the screen, but just a couple of them would be the total harmonic distortion of supply voltage not exceeding 2% through the 13th harmonic, peak value of the test voltage being within 1.34 and 1.49 times its RMS value. They talk about the DC electronic load and how it should maintain current loading set points for each voltage within 0.5%, and it even outlines down to the test room airspeed, which is a valid consideration as well because it'll influence the cooling and the fan's behavior. They also have formulas for describing how much current should be attributed to each voltage rail at each of the load levels. We'll show some of those calculations on the screen, but won't go through the math for that today. 80+ also defines its lab protocol as the steps to do the testing very specifically. Once a line impedance stabilization network is in series with the AC output, the protocol shown on the screen is used to do 80+ efficiency validation testing. Again, if you want to do 80+ validation yourself, they've got all of this documentation available publicly. But we're going to skip over this quickly since it's probably not why you're here. If a manufacturer wants an 80+ certification, there are 6 categories they can choose from, and we'll show those on screen. All they have to do is fill out a form and pay a fee, and their power supply will be entered into the Clear Result testing process. If it passes the protocol that we just went through, they're then cleared to use the 80+ logo for their brand. Here's where it's maybe a little disillusioning. The application's very simple. The hardest question on a lot of these is the address for where the power supply originated. And so there's no questionnaire about what components are in it. There's no schematic for here's the parts that we're using, here's what's always going to be in the power supply. Nothing like that at all. And that keeps it fairly flexible. The drop downs and menus and types of things you can submit to 80+ or Clear Result for 80+ certification basically amount to anything's okay as long as you pay us the testing fee. We'll figure out how to classify it and we'll test it. So just if you're curious how these 80+ numbers come about, where they really originate, There's a form with 19 questions. Again, the most cumbersome is the effort required to type in the address. The certification costs can be seen in this table. They range from $500 to $7,250. 115-volt internal certifications cost $6,000, and a large portion of that is probably to pay the third-party testing company to run a battery of tests. There are some questions about connectors and motherboards and what types of headers there are, how many there are. Part of the application requests the quantities of the number of CPU and what they call PIC, or we're guessing they mean PCI, power connectors, where apparently a power supply can have up to 1,000 of each type, which should maybe be enough for one of our RipJ setups. But there are a bunch of questions about cables and the product spec, and if you're sending something in along with it, like a motherboard. When someone applying is finally ready to add the application to their shopping cart, just like an online website, they can review the licensing and certification policy. And there's some fun stuff in there too. Near the beginning, it has some language in it that supports what Cooler Master said earlier. A manufacturer, from what we understand of this, only has to create one passing sample of a power supply to meet the 80+ certification. There's also some details on how to rebrand a power supply. So since power supplies are commonly made by just a couple of platform vendors, and often manufacturers don't really make them distinct enough to necessarily go through the whole process again, Clear Result makes it easy so that if you are, say, Fantex, maybe buying a Seasonic power supply, there's a process through which you can basically pay to get the already approved Seasonic 80+ sticker applicable to your power supply as well if you're rebranding theirs, at least without significant modification. There's a one-time $5,000 license fee. Every company has to pay this, plus an additional $3,500 recertification fee. With the recertification at $3,500 and the initial certification at $6,000, it looks like there's some processing and setup that has to be done for each new power supply. But once that's done, the actual testing only costs around $3,500. It makes us a little curious where that $2,500 price delta from the other stuff comes from, but $3,500 gives you an idea for sort of the baseline what it costs to get a power supply certified. Obviously goes up a bit from there, but it's not crazy expensive for a company like, say, Cooler Master or Corsair. It is, however, an expense. There's a mention of periodic evaluations to remain in good standing for the certifications. So if a company makes a power supply that's claimed to be 80+ gold, Clear Result basically says it reserves the right to randomly buy or sample those components, test them, and revoke the certification if it no longer stands up to it. We don't know how often this happens. We would assume not very. And it's probably rare enough that someone falls below their certification that it would be taken away. Like the AGS one, for example. Picking that power supply out of all the many tens of thousands of power supplies that are available seems unlikely at best. There is actually a section midway through that covers something like what GN was doing with the Ares game AGS 850 though. There's a challenge process. If we had sent in a formal challenge to the 80+ organization, they would have acquired what they call a production-grade market-ready unit and sent it to their third-party lab for testing. We're hoping this means they would purchase one from a retailer and not just ask the manufacturer to send them one. But then there's kind of a bad part too, although we understand why it's there. If the acquired unit passed testing, they would be then holding the challenger accountable for all the costs associated with the challenge. This is good in that it stops stupid false claims from companies that compete with each other trying to slow each other down, but it's bad because it also really discourages anyone independent from filing a challenge. Because the AGS 850, we even got the company, and this piece isn't meant to be about them, but they're a good example. We even got the company to retest and verify and agree with us that it no longer met the 80+ gold specification. So it was a clear problem because the manufacturer itself is saying that. But to then put up significant risk for Clear Result to potentially source a power supply from who knows where, from who knows what manufacturing period, if they get one from the previous year when it was first certified, maybe it'll pass. It's a lot of risk for any individual lab or person who has done some enthusiast testing at home to file a challenge. And finally, for this document, there's also a section on problems, as in what happens if a manufacturer ends up outside of spec or in violation of something. Well, as we said earlier, there's no 3 strikes model or anything like that. It's just you pay them some more money and then you can recertify your stuff. So it's pretty straightforward in that regard. You resubmit the application, you pay for more testing, and then that's kind of all there is to it, because of course that's how it works. because you're paying for a certification. One thing all of you as viewers should know is the accessibility of 80 Plus reports. ClearResult maintains a Microsoft SharePoint site that lists every power supply that it has ever tested. This is a great way to double check anything that might be a fake 80 Plus product, although it doesn't mean that the product is still 80 Plus. The reports contain 3 graphs and 3 tables. The most beneficial table is the last one, which provides the input and output wattage results that are used directly to calculate efficiency. As for whether there's a better standard out there, there's not many options. 80 Plus is pretty much it. There's no standard that tests the entire scope of a power supply that looks at everything from voltage ripple and safeties and protections up to efficiency. That doesn't exist. There is an alternative from Cybernetics. Cybernetics is run by Eris, who provided input for us when we were doing testing on the gigabyte power supplies. He's an expert. He's been doing it a long time. He's a power supply reviewer, and somewhat recently proposed a new set of certifications that they at Cybernetics are calling ETA. It's based on efficiency results as well, but the biggest differentiators for ETA and 80 Plus are consideration for very low loads, or vampire power, 5 VSB efficiency, and then to get the Cybernetics stamp, a power supply must be compliant with the CEC ERP Lot 6 2010 or 2013 and ERP Lot 3 2014 directives, and also it has to meet all the requirements mentioned in the EU 617/2013 regulation. Cybernetics also tests differently from 80 Plus, so they bump their thermal chambers to a more maybe realistic 30 to 34C. They run PSUs through more than 4 loads, 1450 of them to be specific, and they have connectivity for up to 10 PCIe cables. Now, even though this is a bit better and it's improved over 80 Plus, it's still not a full scope stamp for the quality of a power supply, and it's kind of hard to just put a sticker with one color or whatever the label may be, number on a power supply and say, this is the grade of the power supply, when there's so many aspects that can be in misalignment, where one thing can be good while another is not so good. So ultimately, obviously, the sort of best thing to do is look at the topology and the breakdown of the components and look up reviews if you can find them. Power supply reviews are rare. We've only recently started doing them. Eris has been doing them for a long time, and he's got a lot of them out there, but they're somewhat rare. So ultimately, 80 Plus is for power efficiency and power factor, and that's about it. As long as you use it for those things, it's fine. But don't expect 80 Plus gold power supplies to be good power supplies. There is a strong correlation with, say, platinum or titanium especially, but gold to some extent, and quality. But there's enough of a miss, there's enough missing information too, that it's not a safe bet, and you should go off of as many reviews as you can find of the power supplies you're looking at. That's it for this one, though. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.